Hi, my name's Heather. Today I'm going to be talking about the two short stories and two poems that I read for the family readings. The first written by Lauren Jiff called The Wind, about it's kind of an internal and external conflict. The external conflict is about a mother who is fleeing an abusive husband with her children, and the narrator of the story is actually one of the children who, my apologies, the granddaughter of this mother who is fleeing her abusive husband. And this granddaughter is recollecting a story that her mother is telling her about the abuse of her father, which is kind of confusing. I know that's kind of a lot, having to trace the lineage of like, oh, it's the grandmother and then the mother and then the granddaughter. But yeah, so the external conflict is she is fleeing her abusive husband. She has bruised ribs, her teeth knocked out by a gun. A really, really sad situation, and she is fleeing, and with only $150, I think it was, to her name, some of which she borrowed from just people in the town who are friends of hers who wanted to support her. So it's really scary situation, and externally, and then on top of that, internally, the grandmother, or the mother in the story, she just got violently abused and is somehow having to pull it together for her children, having to survive for her children's sake, and despite the trauma, having to muster up the courage to push through, despite feeling weak, despite feeling pain, she musters through. And at this time, she's starting to realize this, and actually says, and at this moment, my mother saw with terrible clarity that everything depended on her. That scary realization, that the internal conflict of, I have to pull it together for my kids. And I think the overall theme here is just, it's survival and motherhood, and doing what's best for your children. The second short story that I read was called The Years of My Birth by Louise Erdrich. The main character, Tuffy, or Louise, she was adopted into a family, or technically a foster home. She struggles with a lot of rejection and not feeling like she belongs, which is kind of an internal conflict, and that also kind of translates into the external conflict where, her birth mother reaches out to her only to find out that it's not to connect, it's only to use her or ask her to donate one of her kidneys to her dying fraternal brother who she's never known. And her brother who's dying is dying at his own expense, his own fault, because he overdosed. So she now has to come to terms with that, and as she greets him, as she tells him that she plans on doing this for him, he completely rejects her and tells her how ugly she is. And when her birth mother reveals this to her, she says, he's got kidney failure and is on dialysis. He's waiting for a kidney. I'd give him one of mine, but I'm a bad match, and my kidney is old. George is dead. You are your brother's only hope. I put my napkin to my lips and felt myself floating up off my chair. Continues to say, She ends up leaving the restaurant, and the quote continues, "I was heaving and crying when I felt Nancy Lasher's hand stroking my back." So she ultimately feels rejected, feels like, why would she even reach out to me? So really, again, very touching and sensitive story. And then now moving on to the two poems that I read. First poem called Elena by Pat Mora. The imagery in this poem was really kind of very descriptive. How she describes, learning a new language, calling, English words, describing them as thick, describing them as difficult to pronounce, difficult to understand. I would say that the main theme here is isolation, not being able to understand her own children at the table, feeling, the disappointment from her husband on trying to learn a new language. She states, "Sometimes I take my English book and I lock myself in the bathroom, say the thick words softly, for if I stop trying, I will be deaf when my children need my help." So she definitely feels isolated, and feels like she has to almost keep it a secret, and she's embarrassed that she can't speak the language of her children. The second poem that I read was from Diane Seuss. It's called "The Sonnet Like Poverty Teaches You What You Can Do." So this poem, honestly, very touching and very relatable. It teaches, or it rather talks about how poverty imposes a lot of limitations on people, and through those limitations, you have to be creative. There's almost a certain freedom that comes with living in poverty, because you have to learn how to be creative with what you have, or with what you're given, and it teaches you so much. It teaches you how to get creative with meals, meal planning. If you're low on funds, it teaches you, how to manage an income, how to manage money. It teaches you so much, and the comparison here is poverty and how it is like a sonnet, because like a sonnet, there are rigid limitations on the structure of a sonnet, the rhythm and the meters of a sonnet. So the Diane Seuss says, "Wish in one hand," she says, "shit in another. Poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher, the kind that wraps your knuckles with a ruler." So this kind of, discipline keeps people in check, and it means that sonnets have rules that you need to follow, but they can teach you great things like creativity. And that is all. So thank you so much for listening.